this question. With regard to Iran, I'll have allow you folks a minute to respond. Wasn't that Iran's money? Wasn't that money that the international community, the international courts have ruled was their money?
Well, it depends on how you define that, because if the money is gained through ill-gotten measures, I don't believe so. And the second component of it is the lifting of sanctions, which will allow their economy to grow at a clip of 10-12% per year. So, sure, I mean, you could argue it's their money, but it's money that was frozen for a very good reason. Because we cannot allow them to continue to enrich uranium, which they are not using for energy purposes. They are using it unequivocally to build a nuclear bomb. And we cannot allow that to happen. That would be the most dangerous thing our world could have, is Iran having a nuclear weapon. And this, I'm telling you, this agreement is paving the path to that. Because there is not a single government official in Tehran, not a single member of the Iranian parliament that has signed on to that agreement. We are abiding by it, and they are not. We're fools for doing so.
Having approved that agreement, what options would you feel the United States would have if you had a different administration in Congress that was willing to somehow undo that agreement? What path do we take?
We continue sanctions. We increase sanctions to cut down on their cash flow. Because, like I said, there's not a single member of the Iranian parliament, no government official in Tehran that has signed that agreement. Not a single one. We are the only ones abiding by it. We've already seen violations on the Iranian side of this agreement. They are ignoring it, and they are laughing at us because of it.
And if your comments are that you initially opposed the agreement, but you support the implementation, would you clarify that?
Here's the point. The agreement is done. Sanctions are being lifted. Money is flowing into Iran apart from the money that has been discussed here so far this afternoon. For sanctions to be useful and for sanctions to actually have an impact, as they did previously with Iran, they need to be multilateral. You need to have all of the major potential trading partners part of that regime. By the time, if I take office, this agreement will have been in place for over a year. It's not realistic to think that we can somehow undo it. I would love to be able to, but I don't think it's realistic. So what are we left with? We have to do everything we can to enforce this agreement to the letter, and we have to keep the Iranians, abiding by it. But to say that we can undo it, it's not realistic. I mean, the United States can impose sanctions tomorrow, but if the rest of the international community doesn't do that, they're not going to be effective, and that's the reality.
Absolutely.
Steve, they haven't signed the agreement. They're not honoring the agreement. They've already been in violation of the agreement. There's a lot we can do, and I'm telling everybody in this room, and unlike Steve, I'm not learning about this agreement on CNN. I was behind the curtain. I understand the threats. Iran getting a nuclear weapon, which they are on the path to do, would be the most dangerous thing this world has ever seen. We cannot allow it to happen. There's a lot we can do, Steve. We can cut financing off today if we want. We can reimpose sanctions today if we want, if we agree as a government to do so. I'm just telling you that Iran getting a nuclear weapon, for us to put our faith in the Iranian regime that they're going to abide by an agreement that they haven't even signed, is very foolish.
Yeah, it's about 1 minute.
As I said, I did not support this agreement when it was negotiated. But the truth is, we've been dumb about it, that's all we want at this point. And I don't know what curtain we were behind. But the truth of the matter is that we are left with this agreement now. And we act unilaterally, we are not going to have that kind of impact. The sanctions were successful before because it was not just the United States. It was the rest of the international community, our allies, the Chinese. All of those countries were part of it. For us now to unilaterally move to try to do something, it's just not going to work. I wish it would. Believe me, I wish it would. Because I do have concerns about this agreement in terms of what it's going to do at the back end. But we're not in that situation now, unfortunately. So we have to deal with reality, and that's the point.
Okay. We're going to move on. Thank you, gentlemen. This next question, we start with Mr. Santarsiero. Recent terror attacks at home have refocused our attention to the use of electronic surveillance to identify threats from our own citizens. To what extent should we engage in domestic surveillance? And how do we build in constitutional safeguards while doing so?
I think to the greatest extent possible, there needs to be transparency. I think that there needs to be due process. We have to always balance, we always have to balance the need to protect the public in the United States from these threats with our constitutional rights and rights. And that balancing can be difficult at times. But I think the touchstone here has to be to enable people who are potentially subject to this surveillance, if there is a challenge, that they have due process rights. I think that, obviously, we want to make sure that our government is pursuing every thread of potential evidence out there to be able to prevent an attack before it happens. But part of that also has to be this. We have to make sure we have strong relationships in the communities where potential terrorists may be coming from. And part of that has to be not demonizing Muslim Americans. We have in Donald Trump a candidate who has told the world that he would institute a religious test for people coming into this country. Now I know, I've met many times with the Muslim community here in Bucks County, and they are uniformly opposed to Donald Trump. Now, if we're really going to be effective and our law enforcement is going to get the information it needs to stop these attacks, we need to have, first and foremost, good relationships with the folks in that community. And I think Trump is a disaster in that regard. And again, my opponent was supporting him up until just last Saturday. And I think if he were to become president, it would put us in much greater peril than we currently are.
Thank you. Mr. Fitzpatrick?
Once again, on this topic, I'm speaking to it not as a politician talking about it, but someone who's actually done it. Done it with the premier law enforcement, one of the premier law enforcement organizations on this planet. The USA Patriot Act, there was a section 215, which was considered a controversial provision, which came to light during the Eric Snowden scandal. And the USA Freedom Act addressed the controversial provisions of section 215, which was a bipartisan solution to deal with precisely what Mr. Pez asked. Dealing with safeguards to keep our country safe and also protecting and preserving constitutional and civil liberties. What the Snowden scandal told us was that under section 215, the NSA, there were two parts to it. There was a FISA court order component, where there was mass collection of what they refer to as metadata, and the second was the PRISM program. The metadata issue dealt with telephone records and what we call cell site information, the location where you're at while making a cell phone call. And the PRISM program dealt with electronic communications such as emails, social media, and the like. The USA Freedom Act addressed the controversial provisions in a bipartisan fashion, which is something we need to do more in different areas, not just in the area of national security. It's a way to preserve the security of our country while still preserving civil and constitutional liberties.
Thank you.